be here. This is my first year attending this Jews and Race Symposium, though am I close enough?
Not if you turn it more than a day off.
So I'd heard about it, and it's really a phenomenal event that does not take place anywhere else, to have this kind of conversation, to have an engagement with community. So it's really special and a real opportunity to be involved in this. What I wanted to do in my talk is to try to contextualize a little bit about Jews and demography. I called my talk Counting Jews, and what I'm interested in exploring a little bit is understanding what I really see as a kind of Jewish obsession with counting themselves, with quantifying, with surveying. So part of this is sort of an attempt to excavate historically, to understand where that impulse comes from, and then to think about the history of it as related to questions of community definition today and how Jews continue that kind of tradition. So I want to start by talking really briefly about an article that appeared in the Jewish Exponent, which is the Philadelphia Jewish newspaper that has, I think it's been around for about 125 years. And the title of the article was, "It's Time to Be Counted. Plans Underway for 2009 Jewish Population Study." And it announced a major population study that the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia was going to sponsor. And it described the study as such. The study will address important questions about Jewish identity and affiliation, patterns of mobility, household characteristics, socio-demographics, and population estimates. And the results, which I think are supposed to come out relatively soon, have been sort of the buzz in the community. You know, what are we going to find out about ourselves through this? And really, the sort of subject of my class is exactly why do Jews find it so important to be counted? And the argument that I am making is sort of simple, that by counting themselves, I think Jews hope that they can make themselves count. And the project of creating these kind of social, scientific, and survey portraits of Jews is a project of defining community. And it's not simply, of course, a snapshot of the present. It is rather more of a vision for the future. So there are sort of three topics I want to address today, and all of them in a sort of irresponsibly brief fashion. One is the sort of historical roots of this obsession. The second is the kind of ideologies enacted in Jews' fascination with their own demography. And the third has to do with the kind of ways in which this project of counting themselves is fundamentally a kind of existential project for Jews. So that's sort of where I'm going. So let's start a little bit with the kind of historical roots. So obviously this 2009 Philadelphia Jewish population survey is not the first of its kind. The first national United States Jewish population study was in 1972, but we can start much earlier than that. In fact, the Book of Numbers, and I hope you'll indulge me, I'm not a Bible person, but I've read it. So the Book of Numbers begins with what? Why is it called the Book of Numbers?
It's a census.
Right, it begins with a census, right? And so what it says, and this is from really the first verse of the Book of Numbers. This is God speaking to Moses in Sinai. Take a census of the whole Israelite community by the clans of its ancestral houses, every male head by head. So what's the purpose of the census? Well, it seems to be to find all the eligible men who will be able to bear arms, right, to enact an army, and also for tax purposes. Rashi, an 11th century commentator, offers a sort of more transcendent interpretation, saying that God wanted to count all of the Israelites because they were so dear to him. Right? So why do people count? And the lesson maybe from this is that in the midst of creating and reconstructing community, as the narrative of the Book of Numbers is really about, it's important to understand who that community is, right? People count themselves. They want to understand who they are when they're going through that kind of process. It's a way of thinking about boundaries, and it's a way of thinking about power, I think. Okay, so to move a little bit ahead in history, talk about the Enlightenment, which is really the kind of root, I would argue, of Jewish obsession with demography and with counting themselves. And there are two important Enlightenment traits to really think about in understanding the development of social science and of surveying. And these are general traits that then I'll kind of connect back up to Jews and their interest in surveying themselves. The first of the traits is a sort of movement toward greater empiricism and rationalism, right? You'll remember from your European history classes that the Enlightenment is this impulse to rationalize the world, right? To quantify, to have a kind of empirical way of thinking about life as holding the answers to all questions. So that's the first. And the second is this interest in humanism, right? In universalism. What is it that connects all people, right? How is it that we're all alike? But the flip side of this question presents itself fairly quickly, especially given the kind of increasing global contact that people are having during the Enlightenment, which is also, why are we so different? Well, Jewish intellectuals, of course, some of them really become very immersed in this Enlightenment movement. They see it as a kind of pathway toward modernity, toward acceptance, toward citizenship. And they create their own movement, in a sense, in hopes of enlightening and modernizing Judaism. And there are all sorts of products of this, and we could sort of talk forever about this. One is that really the kernel of every modern movement of Judaism, whether we're talking about the most traditional or the quote-unquote least traditional, has a point of origin in the Enlightenment. But three things, I would say, coalesce, sort of come together to dictate how this Enlightenment context and Jews' fascination with the Enlightenment comes to then produce this fascination that Jews start to have with demography and with counting themselves. So there are these three things, right? One is the beginning of a kind of academic approach to studying Jews and Judaism. And this is directly out of a kind of Enlightenment context, as Jewish intellectuals are saying, we want to be taken seriously by the modern world. We want to prove that Jews are not atavistic, they're not clannish, they're not a primitive people, they're a modern people. So we need to then scrutinize ourselves according to these kinds of modern categories, right? So a kind of famous group of German Jewish scholars create this Wissenschaft und das Judentum group to study the scientific study of Jewishness, to really start to put Judaism and the Jewish people up to the kind of standards of Enlightenment study. At the same time, you have the early development of social science. So you have strides being made in anthropology, developing as a discipline, sociology, linguistics, right? These sort of modern ways of knowing developing at the same time. And you also have Jews starting to form what might be thought of as Jewish defense agencies in the 19th century, right? Jews recognizing that despite these Enlightenment promises, anti-Semitism is still continuing, right? Despite emancipation, despite the fact that Jews are gaining citizenship, anti-Semitism is still a reality in their lives. And deciding that this moment of fascination with empiricism and rationalism might offer a way of fighting that anti-Semitism, right? To try to wage a rational case against it. And you have the creation of these defense agencies, right? These groups that are going out and trying to identify where and when anti-Semitic incidents are happening and trying to fight them. And the method that they use really draws from a kind of Enlightenment ideal of rationalism and empiricism and draws from the developing social sciences, which is that they start to study and try to figure out where Jewish population centers are, what the characteristics of Jews are, and use these portraits as a defense against anti-Semitism, essentially to prove that Jews are like everyone else, right? So you have all of these efforts starting in the 19th century, Jews to survey themselves in an attempt to really show that Jews can fit into the modern world, that there's no reason that Jews should be treated that Jews can fit into the modern world, that there's no reason that Jews should be treated any differently. And so you have the kind of beginnings of this intense period of surveying Jewish life. In France, you have a movement, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and that starts in 1860. In the United States, in the Reform Movement, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, as early as 1875, starts like its French counterpart to survey the Jewish population, figure out where Jews are, what they're doing, the professions they're involved in, all in an attempt to create this kind of community portrait that is going to prove that Jews are modern, right? That they need not be treated as if they're clannish or primitive or somehow not for the enlightened modern world. Germany also has various bureaus devoted to the same project. So what emerges by the early 20th century, that many agencies throughout the Jewish world are invested in counting Jews and creating kind of ethnographic portraits of Jews, because you don't just have surveys being done, you also have different researchers going to communities and interviewing people and talking to people and trying to really capture the voices of Jews in different communities. And so you have all of these new portraits of Jewish life being produced at this time. Almost all of the work that's being done by the beginning of the 20th century falls, however, into a kind of ideological battle in a certain sense. And you have some of the portraits being produced by people who are very Zionist in their thinking about Jewish life in the diaspora, who are creating these demographic portraits of Jewish life to prove, in a sense, that Jews cannot thrive or survive in the diaspora. So you have studies of different Jewish communities that are not reproducing themselves, right? There are very low fertility rates. You have studies showing the persistence of anti-Semitism. You have some of these researchers really making the statement through their research that the bottom line is that Jewish life is not going to survive in a diasporic context, and this is an argument for Zionism. So you have all this very Zionist kind of demographic, social scientific material being produced. On the other hand, really at the same time, you have some very assimilationist social scientists using some of the very same data to make the absolutely different case, that Jews are actually starting to intermarry with other populations, and that there's nothing abnormal or unnatural about this. This is the proper chain of events for a modern assimilated people. People showing Jewish economic success in the diaspora, even studies showing how Jews' bodies change as they're becoming more and more assimilated into diaspora society, right? A very assimilationist kind of ideology. And one could explore a lot more about the kind of ideological imperatives of this kind of social scientific data, the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. But what I would say is that demographic data in the Jewish community continues to have a very deeply ideological angle to it, right? That it does not shed its ideology throughout the 20th century in the least. So let's talk a little bit then about the kind of ideologies, especially after they develop after World War II. So after World War II, Jews in the United States sort of realized, whether they like it or not, they're kind of the bookkeepers now of world Jewry, right? I mean, the centers in Europe that had been so invested in the social scientific survey project no longer exist, and American Jews sort of inherit this task. They're very self-conscious in talking about the inheritance of that task. And they realize also that counting Jews now has its sort of different significance, because there are so many fewer Jews to be counted, right? There are less Jews to be counted. They maintain, Jewish intellectuals after World War II, on the whole, maintain a kind of faith in empiricism, a faith in counting, a faith in the kind of rational project of quantifying the Jewish population. That somehow by counting it, this in and of itself is a way of waging the battle against what Hitler was trying to do and ultimately becoming victorious in that battle. And there's a massive outpouring of sociological and demographic studies after World War II. Mainly, these studies are sponsored by Jewish agencies, the American Jewish Committee, which started in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. It is mainly a kind of, it has German Jewish sort of elite roots, becomes very involved in this project of the demography, social scientific study of Jews. And a number of actually intellectual Jewish refugees become the kind of thinkers at these Jewish agencies who are producing the social scientific studies and the data. You also have the fact, I think, fueling this movement of Jews toward a real obsession with counting and studying themselves, the fact that more and more Jews, of course, are let into universities and are getting the academic training to enter the social scientific disciplines where this kind of work is being done. So in effect, Jews are gaining more and more of the professional credentials to be involved in this sort of business. You have an outpouring of journals and conferences and books all devoted to studying the social scientific, the surveys, the demographics of Jewish life after the war. And this coincides also with a trend in American life more generally to be sort of fixated with polling data, with finding the norm, finding the average, Gallup polls, the Kinsey reports after World War II, the sort of idea that through these kinds of surveys of the normal, one can locate oneself and in a certain sense make oneself that norm, right? So this is in line with these trends that are quite strong in the United States after World War II. But the purpose, I think, of these post-war surveys of Jewish life is to create an ideology of Jewish Americanness. And I think you can see this really quite clearly. Much of the way that the demographics of Jews is sort of packaged, it clearly is about fitting Jews into American trends and into American patterns, a sort of self-conscious desire to prove to themselves and to other Americans that Jews experience things like everyone else, right? This desire to assert a kind of Americanness. There's also a major component of the kind of defense agency work that I spoke about arising in the 19th century. And these efforts to fight prejudice that are encoded in these demographic efforts, educating Americans about who Jews are, what Jews do, what they look like, how they pray, trying to prove that Jews are normal, that they shouldn't be discriminated against, and that discrimination in and of itself is un-American, right? So again, these kinds of portraits of community being less about that community per se and more about how the community fits into a larger national identity. But there's also a way in which it's a construction of an American Jewish identity and pride in that identity, trying to assert a kind of new national ideology for the United States where diversity is embraced, right? Where Jews, by being Jews, somehow enhance what America is. And this theme clearly comes out in the kind of demographic work that Jews do after World War II. In coordinating a new round of major studies about Jewry, the American Jewish Committee said that these studies, and this is in I think it was the late 1940s, said that these studies would present Jews to the world with a right to dignity and to the respect of other cultures and civilizations, and secondly, give fiber and strength and vitality to the Jews. So it's an act both of national membership and also of reasserting and reconstructing community after World War II. The reality is that these studies, and you can really see this almost in a painful way after World War II, represent Jews trying to envision themselves into what they want to be and what America should be like after World War II, right? And this is, I mean, I'm talking mainly 40s, 50s, before the kind of Holocaust industry, which is a whole another place where Jews envision themselves, before the kind of Holocaust industry, which is a whole another place where Jews envision themselves, before that takes off. This is a kind of empirical, rational, continuing to those Enlightenment ideals, way of Jews making sense of themselves and hoping against a sort of probably internal sense that maybe it's silly to have this hope, hoping that they will find a place for themselves in the modern world. And what I want to then kind of conclude with is talking about the ways in which demographics for Jews become a kind of existential, have an existential purpose, right? That texts about who is the Jewish community, counting them, like the exponent article said, about affiliation, mobility, household characteristics, population estimates. These become existential texts for Jews, ways that they assert their existence after World War II with in a certain sense, a kind of vengeance. The clear subtext is that there are still Jews around to be counted, and they must be counted. And money must be constantly thrown at the enterprise of counting them, no matter how flawed the methods of counting them continue to be. And it's also asserting a new term, or many new terms of existence. You see in the surveys after World War II, the invention of the category of ethnic, right? You see discussion of what it means to be a cultural Jew, a secular Jew. So this kind of new terminology for describing what Jewish existence is, see very much reflected in how Jews parse themselves, how they count themselves. You also have new categories arising to count Jews who have, come from products of intermarriage or have converted, or different kinds of categories that the demographics then have to embrace. And the kind of, one of the major focal points of post-war demographic studies become intermarriage, right? Because that becomes the kind of place of community anxiety about existence that these demographic efforts are trying to answer. And so you have just a huge amount of money spent on trying to understand how many Jews are intermarrying, are their children remaining Jewish, what can the Jewish community do to make it less likely that Jews will intermarry, as if the answers to that are somehow in the counting of the incidence of this issue. And it is very much this sort of post-Holocaust anxiety as well, right? That sort of age-old dictum that intermarriage gives Hitler the sort of posthumous victory, right? I mean, you see these impulses in these demographic studies, and in the funding structures of them, lay people who there's no real reason that they should necessarily care so much about this survey data, giving huge amounts of money to it, being told that these kinds of surveys will make sure that the Jewish community remains alive, right? That it makes sure that it continues to exist. Very much about existence. And these studies, I think, are occasions for asserting what it means to be Jewish, certainly. And they're clothed in a scientific apparatus, but really anyone, I think, who studies history has to come to understand the sort of diaphanous nature of that scientific apparatus and how encoded with ideology it becomes. So I don't suggest that there's a reason necessarily to do away with these studies, but I think there is a great deal of importance in confronting them for really what they are and what kinds of ideologies about existence and about community are really at the heart of the very project of counting Jews and who should count as a Jew.